saw the sun for the first time today. It's been so long, I thought you'd gone away. And now I feel as though I've been here before. Once again, my friend, I'll
Good evening and welcome to Queeries. I'm Brian, your host, and with me this evening I have the Reverend Dr. Adam Wirrig from St. John's Church of Christ downtown on, I think that's on 3rd Street, isn't it?
Third Street, yes.
Across from that's the beautiful one down across from Square One.
Yes, right across from the cannery.
That's exactly true. So, welcome to the show. This is your first time, correct?
I think so, yeah. I don't quite recall being here.
Yeah, I don't either, but well, welcome.
Well,
It's your first time. There you go. I don't even remember either. We've been doing this so long. This evening I kind of wanted to touch on the topic of religion because religion just in general of late, well, not of late, I mean, this has been a progression, I think, from like the 1980s to where we are presently, has been playing a bigger and bigger role in terms of, everyday life and how everyday life is in essence sort of, I guess, regulated in the political sphere, kind of thing. So, at any rate, so I guess the first question that I would have for you, well, first of all, your denomination is?
United Church of Christ.
United Church of Christ, which tends to be more on the
progressive side
of progressive Christianity. So first of all, how on earth did we get to a point where what I believe is a small subset of Christians within this country, how did they wind up usurping the voice of the Christian church with such small numbers and have now become the brand?
Well, there are multiple answers on this, and you have to really kind of deal with all of them to get the full picture. In one way, what we have identified in academic study is the life cycles of the church itself run about every 500 years. Every 500 years or so, we have this great reformation of some sort or another that really takes us in a very new direction and creates time of great upheaval and change. And if you remember that the well-known Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was, in fact, celebrated its 500th anniversary last fall. So we're right in the beginning point of going crazy again here.
Awesome.
Yeah. I mean, hopefully it's not as wild and woolly as it was last time, but the church is not a stagnant kind of thing that just exists and is on a set continuum. It goes, like all things, into different cycles of being and existence. Now, specifically speaking, there are, I guess, what I would like to call pendulum shifts that happen, much as you, in a way, see in politics over time and period. What you saw, I think, post-World War II, you saw a very concerted effort by mainline Protestant Christianity. So United Methodist, United Church of Christ, Episcopalian, Presbyterians, really focusing on social justice, social reform, social welfare, and with varying degrees of success, obviously. Now, usually after that, what we've identified, because this is not the first time in history that the church has had a period where it's focused on all those things, usually directly after that is a period that swings somewhat back towards what we would call the conservative end of things. And so the issues like personal holiness and that are much more in the forefront. So I think that's very much why you could see in the late 70s, early 80s, the rise of the moral majority and the waning, quite frankly, of the mainline Protestant church. And I think you've seen that up through, I think, the early part of the 2000s. However, again, this is cyclical.
Right.
So I think right now what you're seeing very much is the last gasps of the moral majority and its waning grip on power, so to speak.
And you're saying, now, is that in terms of like the changing demographics of the U.S. in terms of where being Caucasian is not going to be, we're the majority and everyone else is the minority? Is it fear-based?
I think it is a number of different things causing that. I think the fact that minorities are far more prevalent and becoming even more prevalent every day is changing the outlook on Christianity. I think you're also seeing a revitalization of the mainline Protestant church right now by stepping into places where it says, we're not going to pander to fear. We're not going to discriminate on basis of race or sexuality or any kind of stigma that we can imagine. And I think you're seeing society as a whole say, okay, we are, as a culture, far more progressive than we've ever been. And if we're going to be interested in religion, well, then we want a religion that is relevant to our culture. Now, obviously, that does not happen overnight. And again, you're seeing right now some pretty, I would say, terrible things coming out of the religious right.
Well, yeah, I mean, there are a lot of concerns that I've had, like, oh my gosh, a Creflo Dollar. I think, hey, every one of us with $300 my way so I can get yet another jet. You've got Joyce Meyer, who my mother listens to, and I'm like, this whole prosperity gospel movement that I think is just, nothing could be more antithetical to Christianity than that particular movement.
I would absolutely agree. And one of the things that, my ilk and I have had to do is just to stand up and say, that's kind of not how this works.
Right.
That's really not how it's going. And if you want to look at this, it's not a bad thing to be doing well in your life, but to be doing that extravagantly well and to be doing it based off of the religious needs of others, that's just entirely not what this is about.
Well, and that's the thing I think that really kind of, for me, being as hard on organized religion as I am, I grew up Catholic.
Okay.
I mean, right, so Catholic educated right through my bachelor's degree kind of thing. And I actually went through a period where I, as a Catholic, was kind of oddly conservative, which is because it was me dealing, in essence, with my own internalized homophobia at the time. But when I went to UD, there was a time where I actually forget the name of the priest at the time, but during the Christmas on campus, for example, he, during the homily, was talking about how the Catholic Church needs to, reconsider the role of women within the church and all that. And so me and a group of friends went out and got a map, circled Rome on the map, and sent it to him and said, just in case you've forgotten where you get your orders from, And I look back on that and I go, what the hell was I thinking? But to me, I think what just boggles my mind is that if you're a Christian, the way that I look at it, you've got 4 Gospels that you need to look to in order to see how Christ himself behaved, what he thought, what he taught, the whole 9 yards. Anything outside of that, I view as, well, that's interpretation, and that, Paul, and at the time, I've got 4 Gospels, and I don't see Christ at any point in those 4 Gospels behaving as this group over here does.
Well, I certainly think you're not going to find that in the Gospels, and I don't think you're going to find that in the rest of the biblical canon as well, if you really start to get down into it and really don't just rely on your own personal interpretation, but really start examining some of the texts and the passages. I think you're going to really find that that's just not the case at all. And that's been a thing. I think the mainline church has really had to start stepping up and stepping into and saying, okay, let's talk about where we get relevancy and where we get moral authority from and what that means, and not just including that for those who are leading in religion, but trying to bring everybody along. Like, okay, let's talk about where we get ideas. Let's talk about where our thoughts on this or that come from and how we get to the point that we say we do as a denomination and things like that. So I am seeing very much a renaissance in a lot of places within a number of different mainline denominations right now. I won't say that they're perfect by any means, because Lord knows they're not.
Well, but who could be? I mean...
but It's definitely, it is in its own way an exciting time for us, and also yet an incredibly challenging time, because you still are having spiritual advisors to the president who are just way out in no man's land,
Right.
making statements in such that people are going to trust because they heard it on TV, and yet it's like, no, no, that is so not how this game works.
Well, and I think the other problem is because I had a conversation with my mother, who is very, as it turns out, religious, and we got into a conversation about the Bible and general belief in God, that sort of thing, and I basically, she said, well, you're a trained historian, weren't you taught to believe what you read? And I said, well, no, because we had to have multiple sources that we may be able to find the actual kernel of truth in all of that. But I said there are multiple perspectives that you have to look from. Some are more correct than others. Others are just plain wrong, as far as that goes. And and I said, when you look at the Bible, I mean, how many times has that book been rewritten? How many times has it been mistranslated? How many times have politics led to the inclusion or the exclusion of certain books, which may or may not have been problematic at the time? And I also said, we don't really, I mean, we can understand to a point the culture of the time. We can't fully understand it because we didn't live it. We just have to kind of make our best guess. And, I choose not to think that, we should follow literally everything lock, stock, and barrel the way you want to interpret it, as this is the way it's going to be, because...
No, I think you're absolutely right. In fact, when you were making some of those points, I was chuckling because my doctorate actually focuses on the history of biblical interpretation, translation, and reception. And I keep an active research portfolio in that field. And it's something that some people would say is very faith-shattering. For me, it's been very faith-edifying. In
what sense?
In that you start to find that there are things that translate no matter what. But you also find that there are things that you go, oh, wow, that was weird. That's not right. That is very much a product of our own, of the society at the time, the politics of the time, et cetera. But it really opens your eyes to see what's happening in your own reality and go, okay, wait a minute, are we doing the same thing here? And trying to, it serves as, I would say, something of a guidepost to be able to go, okay, am I really going the right direction with this? Do we need to make a change on this? Are we repeating the ills of history all over again? And how do we stop that if we are?
Well, and I think too, because I'm big on, I love language. I mean, I'm not even remotely, I have no knowledge of any of the ancient biblical the various languages that the Bible has been written in and translated into and then translated from and all of that. But what I do understand too, in just, when I write, is that words matter. And then those words, their meanings can be shifted ever so slightly by the overall context in which those words are written. Which is why people, really should probably be more careful with how they write. And, I went to with my ex from long ago, went with him and his grandmother to the Assemblies of God church that she went to.
Well, that must have been it.
That was especially as a Catholic, because I'm like, why is there a PowerPoint presentation up there, and why is there a band down? This makes no sense to me. But on top of that, there was a point where, apparently some kids had gone to some sort of competition about how well they knew the Bible and biblical quotes and all that, and I'm sitting there completely patently unimpressed by it, because I'm like, well, great, but that's a bunch of cherry picking crap that you're dealing with right there. I mean, is that one of the things too, that there's just such a high level of biblical illiteracy?
Absolutely. I would say that is entirely one of the issues we have right now, and that for a long time the church relied on a process of confirmation to teach people what they were supposed to know, and the thought that, hey, if we teach you this one thing when you're in your teenage years for a couple years, and you'll have it all figured out then, or you'll have it figured out enough to be able to function for the rest of life. Well, that's a bunch of crap.
Right.
I'm not saying that it's not worthwhile to have confirmation programs, and I think they're in a number of ways very useful. At the same point in time, though, what we've really realized, I think, since then is that if we're not educating adults just as much as we're educating youth or children, we are really setting ourselves up for failure in society. And you start seeing this with people who have a Bible verse for everything and ignore the fact that one of the first things we learn in academic theology is if there's one answer you can give that will always be right, it is context.
Sure.
Because context really does determine what it is you're trying to understand here. But you have a vast number of people who will pull out verses from places where they go, but the Bible says this, and it's like, oh, you don't want to use that verse because you are not going to like what comes right after that.
Right.
It's the classic one, of course, being people who pull up Sodom and Gomorrah or the Levitical Code and say, well, the Bible says this and that about gay people. Well, yes, it does.
And here's the laundry list of other things.
At that time, here's the list of other things that if you want to adopt that moral code, you don't get to choose a little bit of this, a little bit of that. This is not a buffet. You have to take it all.
Lock, stock, and barrel.
And you are really not going to like
a lot of that.
I would say any of it, really, because it is not a pleasant.
Well, that's honestly the thing that kills me too, especially in regard to even thinking in terms of like originalists in terms of the Supreme Court, that we're going to interpret this the way that it was interpreted back in the 18th century. Okay, well then hopefully if you really want to do that, then you're getting the same level of medical care, the same diet plan. Go full on in if you really believe that. And I think that now, correct me if I'm wrong, since you brought up Sodom and Gomorrah, wasn't it later on? I don't know, because I'm Catholic, so I don't know I don't really know my books of the Bible, so to speak. But was it Deuteronomy or something which basically said that the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah was the fact that they were inhospitable?
You find that referenced in the Old Testament in a couple places, but the most famous one would be where Jesus talks about the sin of Sodom and its pride and its willingness to hurt others is really the thing that causes
clincher.
its downfall. The culture itself is but a symptom of the inward ill of pride and anger, and it's it really, in a lot of ways, that really takes the oomph out of the Sodom and Gomorrah story in the way that people like to use it. Or have traditionally tried to use it.
Right.
It's really not about that at all.
Do you think that some of this too is also just a matter of because to a large degree, when I'm thinking about evangelicals, the moral majority, or whatever you want to call them, that to me they resemble more like the Pharisees of the time than they do actual followers of Christ, because they're so rigid when it comes to the law, whatever the law is.
Well, this is where I think it's easy for us to descend into tribal language and such. And my Jewish friends are always telling me, "Oh, could you please stop comparing your people that you don't like to the Pharisees? It's really kind of
offensive from that standpoint."
Yeah, they're like, it's like, all right, you probably have a point on that. So I'm trying not to use that kind of description
term
anymore. But I'm really trying not to use the word evangelical as a substitute for fundamentalist. Because there are people, evangelicalism is in its own self just a certain practice in spirituality and a certain outlook. It's not necessarily conservative. There are people who are very evangelical, a great number really, I would say, who are quite progressive. But fundamentalists, you can look at the story of Jesus and his interactions with the Pharisees, and what you can see is the dangers of fundamentalism. You're not seeing the Pharisees themselves as a religious practice being called out. What you're seeing is their hard line and their unwillingness to change as being called out.
Gotcha.
And they're failing to recognize the fact that God is leading not towards yesterday, but towards tomorrow. And that generally requires a level of change, maybe not overnight, maybe not directly. And it doesn't mean that you shouldn't question or go, wait a minute, let's talk about this.
Sure.
But you really see that, I mean, the whole gospel narrative is in its own way a parable of the danger of fundamentalism. And fundamentalism does not know any one sect or outlook or anything of the type. You can have progressive fundamentalists just as much as you can have conservative ones. But I do think you're seeing right now. What you're seeing is, I think, I call it the Star Wars analogy.
Okay.
Because you kind of have this thing where fundamentalist outlook and ideology has really been the thing that has been driving religious conversation for the last 30 years or so. Or at least we might say the thing that makes the news clips, because they tend to have better sound bites than we progressives do. But you're seeing a lot of people walk away from that and go, this doesn't reflect my life in any way, shape, or form. They are told the evils and ills of gay and lesbian people, and yet they meet people who they find out are gay or lesbian and realize that's not true at all.
Yeah, I don't have a pentagram or anything in my living room, and I'm not out to disrupt marriage, and I'm really quite boring, even for being gay. So it's
I understand. But I think in a number, and that's just one example. I think they're realizing a lot of things that this just is not. This isn't right. This isn't working. And I think the greatest example of that for me was when the Southern Baptist Convention recently came out and said, we have to start separating religious belief and political ideology from one another, because this is not what we are supposed to be about.
Right.
And I darn near fell off my chair when I read that. And just went, what?
Let me reread that.
It's like, did you guys run this by Jerry Falwell beforehand? Not that you could, because he's dead, but I'm sure his son would have had.
Right, exactly.
But I think what you're seeing, and getting back to the Star Wars analogy, you have a rebellion happening, and what you have is, you have denominations like the United Church of Christ, like others, speaking out and saying, no, you can be welcoming, you can be loving and gracious and accepting, you can, in fact, find, peace with one another in this world, and all these other things that are, antithetical to what the fundamentalist culture says. And people are starting to pick up on that. The interesting thing is, though, much like the Empire in Star Wars, groups that are in power tend not to give up power very easily. So I joked with a friend who's in the fundamentalist world the other week that I used Carrie Fisher's line to Grand Moff Tarkin. The more you tighten your grip, the more you try and control people, and the more you try and make sure that your worldview is the only worldview, the more everything will just slip through your fingers.
Excellent. And on that, let's take a break, and we'll be right back.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for Gnoming Around. I'm Mike the Gnome. I'm going to bring to you some information for a very popular perennial to zones 4 to 9, the lily. I'm going to briefly touch on the major varieties and types of lilies and some basic information for each. First is the Asiatic lily. These are by far the easiest lilies to grow. They're also the earliest lilies to bloom, generally mid to late spring. This variety doesn't tend to have a scent, but they do have the widest variety of colors. The height of the Asiatic lily can range from 2 to 4 feet. There are also miniature versions that only get to about a foot or so tall. These do well in complete full sun or low sun locations. Mine do very well in a run along a fence that only gets 2 to 4 hours of sun a day. Our second variety is probably the most sought after, is the Oriental lily. This lily is much taller than the Asiatic, with most being between 3 and 6 feet tall. They bloom later in midsummer mostly. Their blooming colors range from the light reds and pinks to the whites. These, however, are very fragrant, and hummingbirds just love them. If you have a section of these, you will love how the breeze will just bring that scent to you. And the third kind that we're going to talk about is the trumpet lily. These are pretty similar to the Oriental lily, and they do get quite tall, about 5 feet tall, but they tend to be a little less fragrant as the Oriental lily. But the major difference really is the shape of their bloom. They get their name from the trumpet look, being more of a large tube. Time for the more you know. The lily is said to have been created from the breast milk of Hera, wife of Zeus. The goddess Venus was apparently so envious that she caused the pistil to grow through the middle of the flower's bloom. In general, the lily has always been a symbol of purity. Particularly for the death of children, martyrs, and saints, lilies have been sprinkled on the ground or around their graves throughout history to represent purity passing on. This is why lilies are also looked at to be a sign of death as well. No matter the purpose, lilies have always been referred to as the pure flower. And that's the more you know. If you plan to use lilies in your garden, which you should consider planting them in a mass or in groups together. This gives a wow factor to all that intensity of color and magnificent blooms, regardless of the variety that you have. You may also want to consider different varieties of lilies, so that way you have consistent and constant bloom throughout the mid-spring to late summer. I hope you enjoyed our time for the lily. Until next time, I hope to see you out gnoming around.
And thank you for coming back. And we're going to wrap up episode 1 here, and we're going to pick up with Carrie Fisher. Love her for episode 2. So thank you for watching the show, and we'll see you for episode 2.
So